Welcome to War Stories and Fairy Tales. I'm Scott, I'm your layman, and this is our history of war. And today I'm here to wish you a Merry Christmas, or if you don't celebrate Christmas, a Happy Holiday, however you choose to celebrate it. Hell, if you don't celebrate anything this time of year, Happy Wednesday. But for me, today is Christmas. It's a day many of us like to get together with our families, exchange gifts, and eat too much. More broadly, it's a day to celebrate a feeling of peace and goodwill, not just for our families, but for, well, everybody. And for Christians, it's a holiday to celebrate the birth of Jesus and the birth of the whole religion. That's the tradition it comes from for most of us, even though many of us do more of a secular celebration these days. Hello, History Kitty. And that's where most of the guys fighting on the Western Front in 1914 were coming from. Because today we're going to talk about the Christmas Truce of 1914, just a few months after the First World War started. So what was the Christmas Truce, and how did it happen in the middle of one of the most brutal wars in human history? Well, we probably need to back up and talk about how the war started first. Now, if you made it through your 9th grade world history class, you probably know that World War I started when a Serbian terrorist named Gavrilo Princip shot Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife in Sarajevo in June of 1914. And if you've been on the internet more than about half an hour, you've heard that the assassin thought he'd failed his mission and stopped for a sandwich and got lucky when the Duke's car pulled up outside the restaurant he was just walking out of. And all he had to do was just step up and fire his pistol. Shit luck for the Duke, but this is the kind of thing that makes history. That led to Germany invading France through Belgium, which led to the UK coming in to help defend France, and Russia attacking from the east to keep the Austro-Hungarian Empire busy until the Brits and the French could kick the Germans back to their side of the border. Simple, right? Well, truth is, it wasn't nearly that simple. The roots of the First World War went back a long time before June 28, 1914. Even before the spiderweb of treaties pretty much guaranteed that all of Europe would be dragged in when, not if, the shooting started. See, the nations of Europe had been really good at killing each other for a long time before 1914. And about once a century, they got into a war that was so destructive it inspired them to maybe throttle back for a little while. That was the 30 Years' War in the 1600s, the 7 Years' War in the 1700s, and the Napoleonic Wars in the 1800s. So the Napoleonic Wars ended in 1815 when a coalition of British and Prussian troops under the Duke of Wellington defeated the French under Napoleon at the Battle of Waterloo. They certainly fought other wars in the 19th century, but that was the one that really kind of knocked everybody for a loop. By 1914, nobody who had lived through the wars of Napoleon was still around. Europe was due for another major war. Oh, I don't think that was any part of any nation's decision-making process, but looking at the situation through the lens of history, it sure looks like they kind of had a sense of that. And since the last war, they had developed all kinds of cool new toys. Machine guns, repeating rifles you didn't have to reload but at every 5th shot. Long-range artillery that could be loaded and fired much faster than the old 19th century guns. They knew how to put artillery and troops on train cars so they could move around the theater of war within days rather than weeks or months. They had ships bigger than any ships that had ever come before, armored with some of the biggest guns anybody had ever seen. Battleships could engage each other from beyond the horizon in the right conditions. Submarines could kill without ever showing themselves. And airplanes? Well, nobody really knew what to do with airplanes in 1914, but they figured they'd find a use for them. And somehow, nobody stopped to think that all these new toys they were so excited about, well, the guys they were going to war against had them too, which kind of eliminates whatever advantage they thought they had. So pretty much all the nations of Europe were convinced that any war that came up was going to be easy, at least for their side. And they were just itching for a chance to prove it. The spiderweb of treaties we talked about a minute ago had some deterrent effect, to be sure, but It also guaranteed that anything that started as a regional war would escalate right off the bat. And that's more or less what happened. When Gabrielo Princip fired his pistol, the dominoes started falling. A month after the assassination, the Austro-Hungarian Empire declared war on Serbia. Russia mobilized its troops to protect Serbia. Germany declared war on Russia. France, allied with Russia and knowing damn well the Germans were going to come for them at any excuse, started mobilizing. Germany sent a request to Britain to stay neutral when the shooting started. Britain, who had never much liked France and Russia but saw Germany as a potential threat to its naval superiority, told the Germans to go pound sand. Britain agreed to help Belgium if it became involved, much like Russia was helping Serbia. Germany demanded Belgium allow its troops to march through on their way to France. Belgium said hell no. Germany declared war against France. Germany invaded Belgium on the 4th of August. Britain demanded Germany withdraw its troops from Belgium, then declared war when Germany did not reply. And finally, the first British units arrived in France on the 7th of August. So the Germans attacked south out of Belgium, driving almost to Paris before the French and British stopped them at the Battle of the Marne in September. Germans dug in on the east bank of the Ain River and both sides started working their way north, each one looking for a way to turn the other's northern flank and digging in to prevent their own flank from being turned. These days we call this phase the Race to the Sea, and it ended on the 19th of October when the trench lines had been extended all the way to the North Sea coast of Belgium. Around the same time, something similar was happening to the south as the lines were extended down to the Swiss border. Switzerland, if you're curious, was one of the only neutral countries whose neutrality was never violated in 2 world wars. Probably because everybody knew taking it would be way more expensive than any benefit they might gain from holding it. There'd be plenty of fighting in the next 4 years. But the shape of the lines of battle on the Western Front in October 1914 were pretty close to their shape when the war ended in November 1918, minus a few million brave young men. So why trenches, and what would they have been like? Well, it's hard to describe the destructive power of a rifle bullet in words. A .30 caliber bullet, more or less the standard for World War I, will penetrate a 1/4 inch of steel at 300 meters. You know how in movies the cops always take cover behind car doors? Looks cool, but that's not much better than zero protection. Unless your car is armored with Kevlar and steel, a First World War rifle is going to punch right through it. That's the whole car, not just the door. And it's not just rifles you need protection from. A good rifleman can empty his 5-round magazine in 2 or 3 seconds. A Maxim machine gun, the German general-purpose machine gun, can send 20 or 30 rounds your way in that same time. And there are big guns raining explosive shells down in your general vicinity at the same time, throwing razor-sharp shrapnel in every direction. Now, you could try to protect yourself by surrounding yourself with steel. But steel is heavy and expensive, and your average infantryman just can't carry enough of it to make a damn bit of difference. Or you could use dirt. Now, you need a lot more dirt than steel to protect yourself. But pretty much anywhere you go, you can find dirt. And when you pile it up to make a barrier to hide behind, you also dig down so that your pile doesn't have to be as high. And eventually you figure out that the hard-packed dirt you have to dig through actually provides better protection than what you pile up top of it. So you figure out how to dig down while minimizing how much piling you do. And once you've done that, for your own position, you're going to want to connect your position to your buddies so you can go over there without having to expose yourself. And before long, all your positions are connected. Congratulations, now you have a trench. But if you ever left a bare dirt surface exposed to the elements, especially a vertical surface, you know it's more complicated than that. Because bare dirt breaks down quickly. Water, wind, people climbing on it. Pretty much everything is going to make that dirt surface want to break down. And that's before you even add explosions into the mix. And if you're going to stay there more than a couple of days, you're going to need to find a way to maintain it. So you constantly have to keep your trench from doing what it wants to do. Installing wooden walls to cut down on erosion is going to help, and so will bagging some of the spoil, that's the dirt you removed when you dug the trench, and piling the sandbags up along the walls. You're also going to want to dig some dugouts, which are whole rooms that are completely underground. These are handy for comfort, like protecting you from the rain or giving you a place to sleep during the day if you have to be up and about at night. Remember the artillery? Dugouts are a great place to hide from that as well. You'll be mostly safe there as long as a big round doesn't score a direct hit right on top of your dugout. But there's a problem with all this digging. Water runs downhill, and there aren't many places lower than the bottom of your trench. Which means in a climate like Western Europe, your trench is pretty much always going to have mud in the bottom, if not standing water, which is its own problem. Ever hear trench foot? That's when your feet get pruny like you've been in the bathtub, except they can't get dry because if you climb high enough to get your feet out of the water long enough to dry them out properly, you're going to get shot. I've had it, and it's not much more than annoying most of the time, but it makes the soles of your feet soft, and it can make the skin crack. And if you can't keep them clean, you're at serious risk of infection, which would take your ass right out of the war just the same as a bullet, especially in an age before antibiotics. So, you're constantly wet and muddy, and as long as you're on the front, you're not going to get clean. What's more, your food's wet and probably cold as often as not, and if you smoke, which everybody did, you're going to have a hell of a time keeping your cigarettes dry, especially in the spring and fall when it rains all the time. And did I mention the constant risk of being shot? So, yeah, not ideal living conditions. So you're stuck in this trench in some pretty unique conditions for months on end. And there are two groups of people in the world who have the capacity to understand what this experience is like. Your buddies who are sharing the trench with you, and the guys on the other side of no man's land, which is the space between the trenches. That space might be anywhere from 50 meters to a quarter of a mile wide. Now, nobody could spend months at a time in those conditions without going over the edge. British units would generally rotate between the frontline trenches, reserve trenches a little farther back from the front, and camps in the rear, spending 4 to 6 days in each one. The German rotations may have been a little bit longer because they worked harder to make their trenches more comfortable. But over the course of your unit's frontline rotation, you'd hear the guys on the other side talking to each other, maybe even talk a little shit with them across no man's land. Not a lot of the British soldiers spoke German, but a lot of the German soldiers apparently spoke English. Hell, some of them had lived in England before the war, going to school or working jobs. And after a while, they weren't just talking shit to each other. They'd exchange news between the trenches, asking about sports scores, even asking for news about friends the Germans knew back in England. Because at the end of the day, these were all young men, living in similar conditions with similar interests. And most of them cared more about home and family and girls and their favorite teams than they did about killing each other. And in quiet parts of the front, a sort of a live and let live approach to trench warfare developed. Each side might give the other one a little grace when it came to exposing themselves, even allowing guys to stand up and improve their positions or do maintenance on the edge of the trench. Occasionally, they might even agree to let each other come up all the way out of the trenches and collect their dead from no man's land for proper burial. Any aggressive action would obviously bring an appropriate response, but in some parts of the Western Front, live and let live was a way of life. Seems like this was more common in the British sectors than in the French sectors. The French and the Germans had a little more bad blood between them than the Brits and the Germans. And, the Germans hadn't invaded the Brits' home. These kind of conditions would become more and more rare as the war dragged on, but in 1914, the worst of the carnage was still ahead of them. I think in 1914, the guys in the trenches still thought maybe the higher-ups would come to their senses and figure out a different way to solve whatever disagreements had landed all these poor bastards here. So that's the situation going into the Christmas season in 1914. Not so hard to see how some of these guys might have decided to give each other a break for the holidays. No shit. There they were. The BS meter for this war story is about a 4 out of 10. This one's largely accurate, but there does seem to be some confusion and sources conflict on whether or not the truce really happened. That said, there are a few eyewitnesses in the sources I used, so I'm inclined to believe it myself. And most of the sources I found for this event talked about what happened in the British sector. It seems like it maybe happened in a few places in the French sectors, and there was at least one example on the Eastern Front between the Austrians and the Russians. But most of what I found was from the point of view of the British, so that's what I'm going to talk about here. There was a fair bit of sentiment across Europe supporting an official truce, at least for Christmas Day, and maybe Christmas Eve if the generals were feeling generous. Pope Benedict XV himself suggested such a truce on the 7th of December, but both sides either ignored the suggestion or told him to go pound sand. But the troops took matters into their own hands. On Christmas Eve, British soldiers started noticing little Christmas trees lit up with candles popping up from the German trenches, and as darkness fell, they started to hear singing. Of course, it didn't happen all across the front, and the British didn't react the same everywhere it did happen. There were some places where they shot the candles out of the Christmas trees, and some places where hardcore commanders realized what was happening and ordered artillery barrages to remind the guys to knock it off. But in some places, the British troops took the risk and stood up out of their trenches, and they didn't get shot. And they started singing along because a lot of Christmas carols follow the same tune in English and German, even if the lyrics are in a different language. And on Christmas Day, they got all the way up out of their trenches and walked into no man's land, unarmed. For the most part, they stuck to their side, not pushing past the halfway point, so the enemy wouldn't think they were trying to scope out their trenches. In most areas, they did what they had always done and buried their dead. In at least one place, the Brits gave the Germans a couple of the crosses they used to mark graves. But when that was done, they stayed out there. They shook hands, tried to communicate. They traded cigarettes and food and booze. Some of them traded uniform buttons or even insignia. In one case, the Germans gifted the British a keg of beer made by a Belgian brewery just behind the German lines. But the beer was so bad, the Brits shelled the brewery the next day. And I gotta say, I understand. And in at least a few places, somebody brought out a football. Now, all these stories say it was football, but I'm pretty sure it was a soccer ball because Europe has never really accepted football as a proper sport, and they still insist on calling soccer by the wrong name. Looks like most of these soccer matches were really just a bunch of guys kicking the ball around, a little like Americans playing catch with a baseball or throwing a football back and forth. But in one case, they managed to play a proper game, which the Germans won 3-2. And they swapped stories about home, and they told lies about women, and they talked shit about each other. You know, the things young men do when they get together. And as the sun went down, they went back to their trenches. In some places, the unofficial ceasefires remained in place for a few days, but most units went back to business as usual the next day. Of course, not everybody was on board with the truces, even in the areas where they happened. Soldiers on both sides refused to participate, and some were pretty vocal about it, including a young fellow you may have heard of by the name of Adolf Hitler. And there was some violence. In a few places, units that had recently taken casualties fired on enemy soldiers who tried to come out into no man's land, or dropped a few artillery or mortar rounds to discourage unauthorized fraternization. In some cases, units on one side or the other who didn't join in with the truce fired on enemy soldiers in the next door sector that did. And of course, the higher command pretty much lost their shit. Lieutenants and captains largely went out into no man's land with their men. Majors, lieutenant colonels, those guys more or less understood their soldiers' desire for a little downtime, even if it was with the enemy. But the generals, who rarely ventured down into the trenches in the First World War, thought it was damn near treason. And they made sure to issue orders strictly forbidding informal ceasefires and fraternization later in the war. Now, even those orders didn't stop it completely. There were attempts every year, sometimes successful, but they became much more rare in 1915, 16, and 17. And by Christmas 1918, the war was over. It's the kind of story people would reject as unbelievable if you wrote a story about it. But that's sometimes the best kind of war story. The things that never could have happened, but did. Obviously, there's no scorecard this time. Not sure how I would even score something like this. Anyway, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this war story, I hope you'll give me a thumbs up and subscribe to hear more. And send a link to that friend you're thinking about. You know, the one that came into your head when I said that just now. And let them know you think they'll like this episode. And if you celebrate Christmas, I hope you have a Merry Christmas. If you don't, I hope you enjoy whatever you do celebrate this time of year. And if that's nothing, well, enjoy a few days off or cash in a little overtime. And until next time, I'm Scott, reminding you to piss when you can. Have a good one, Merry Christmas, and Happy Holidays.